Have you ever wondered what life was really like for women back in Tudor England? Beyond the kings and queens? Today, we're going to spend a day in their shoes, from the lady of the manor all the way down to the woman working the fields, to see what their world was actually like. This quote right here, it gets to the very heart of the problem, doesn't it? So much of what we know about women from this time comes from piecing together little clues, like scraps from letters or household budgets, because their day-to-day lives just weren't seen as important enough to write down. So that's our job today, to piece together that hidden history. All right, so here's our game plan. We're going to follow the rhythm of a single day, from sunup to sundown, to see just how much a woman's social standing shaped every single moment of her life. Okay, let's jump in. Before we can even talk about a Tudor woman's day, we have to get our heads around the world she lived in. And believe me, it was rigid. So this pyramid wasn't just a suggestion. It was basically the law of the universe for them. It was called the Great Chain of Being, and the idea was that God put everyone in their specific place. Whether you were the king at the top or a laborer at the very bottom, that was your spot. And it defined pretty much everything about your life. And for all the incredible stories we hear about the royal court, you have to remember this number. A whopping 90% of the people lived out in the countryside. Their lives weren't about fancy parties and political drama. They were about the harvest, the weather, and pure survival. So with that picture in your mind, let's imagine the sun coming up. Because as it does, two completely different realities are kicking into gear. The contrast here is just wow. Okay, so on one side, you've got the noblewoman. She's gently woken by her maids who help her get into all those complicated layers of clothing. On the other side, the peasant woman is woken up by a rooster and boom, she's already working, getting the fire going, feeding the animals. But look closely. See that one thing they have in common? Prayer. Rich or poor, the day always began with God. Now, for women who were in service in these great houses, life was a whole other thing. Let's look at a real person to make this clear. Anne Harris. She worked for King Henry VIII as his royal laundress. She wasn't nobility, but her job put her right in the middle of all the action. And her morning? Well, her morning was something else. Okay, get ready because this is wild. Doing laundry wasn't just about soap and water. It was a full-on chemical experiment. Step 1, collect urine. Yup, urine, which they called chamber lye. They'd let it sit for days until it acted like bleach. Then they'd make their own soap from ash and animal fat. And for the big stuff, you'd literally get into a giant tub and stomp on the clothes with your feet. And this right here, this was the reality of her job. Anne said the absolute worst part was washing the bandages from King Henry VIII's disgusting leg ulcers. Think about that. It was a secret, smelly, stomach-churning task. And she had to be so careful. One wrong word about the king's health and she could lose her job or even her life. All right, let's move on to the middle of the day. And, there was no clearer sign of the gap between the rich and the poor than what they ate. But first, let's clear something up. The idea of breakfast like we have it today, it wasn't really a thing for most people. The day revolved around two main meals. Dinner, which was eaten around 10 or noon, and supper in the late afternoon. You might grab some bread and ale if you were a laborer, but a proper sit-down meal came later. The difference in where that food came from is just mind-boggling. At Hampton Court, the kitchens were like a factory. We're talking 55 rooms and a staff of 200 men, just for cooking. Meanwhile, a peasant woman was cooking in a single, smoky room over an open fire. And what was she making? Usually a pottage, which was basically a thick stew that just kept simmering, with new bits thrown in every day. So, we come to the afternoon, and this is where the daily lives of these women just completely split into two different worlds. For one, it was about learning and leisure. For the other, it was just more work. This chart just lays it all out, doesn't it? A noblewoman's education was designed to make her a good wife and a good manager of a giant household. So she learned languages, how to play music, and just enough math to keep the books. A peasant woman's education, it was 100% practical, stuff passed down from her mother. How to use herbs for medicine, how to spin wool, when to plant the crops. Her very survival depended on these skills. So a noblewoman's afternoon might look relaxing, but it was all pretty strategic. Embroidery showed off her skill and patience. Playing music made her an entertaining hostess. And those social gatherings, they weren't just parties. They were where powerful families made connections and deals. It was all part of the job. And for the other 90% of women, this slide says it all. The idea of a leisurely afternoon, it just didn't exist. There was no break. It was just a nonstop cycle of work that started at sunrise and didn't end until it was too dark to see. But as the sun goes down, something interesting happens. The really sharp, distinct differences between these women start to blur a little bit, and we begin to see the things that connected all of them, no matter how much money or power they had. Take marriage, for example. It was central to every woman's life, but it meant very different things. For the nobility, marriage was a business deal. It was about combining lands, forging alliances, and gaining power. Love? That was a nice-to-have, not a must-have. For peasants, while there was still a ton of pressure, there was often a little more room for personal choice. A marriage was a partnership, built on the need to work together to survive. And this number just hangs over everything we've talked about. The average life expectancy was only about 35 to 40 years. Life was incredibly fragile, and death was a constant presence, whether you lived in a castle or a cottage. So here's the bottom line. Despite the huge differences in their day-to-day lives, all Tudor women were stuck with the same fundamental challenges. Giving birth was incredibly dangerous for everyone, from a queen to a milkmaid. Legally, a woman barely existed. First, she was her father's property, and then she was her husband's. These were the chains that bound all of them. Which leaves us with this one last question to think about. When we look back at these lives, so different on the surface, but shadowed by the exact same dangers and rules, what's the real story? Is it the story of class? Or is it the shared story of what it meant to be a woman in a world that was built by and for men?